Hey everybody, welcome back to the lab. My name's Garrett from Gravitee, and we're here today with another tutorial about how to set up a proxy system or an API gateway to be able to connect to an event-driven backend so that we can expose our event-driven system to the world or to partners. We're going to be specifically using Kafka from Apache, and we've set up two applications that are going to consume and produce events for us. We're also going to set up our gateway, go through all the instructions there, as well as setting up an API key to make sure that our gateway is secure. So stick with me. I'll pull up my screen and we'll get going. Alrighty. Now that we've got our screen up and we can kind of see what we're doing, let's go ahead and talk about what we've got going on and give you the lay of the land. For any of you that don't know, we're using Kafka today, and that is a service offered by Apache. It is an open source service, and it is a message broker. What we mean by message broker is it pushes things onto a message and you can pull things off. To do that, you have to have a producer to push things on and a consumer to pull things off. And what they do is they push events onto this system. The system stacks those events and you can pull them off as they show up, or you can reach in and grab a bulk of them. And there's a whole bunch of information on Kafka. If you don't know how to set that up, there's a ton of tutorials on that. I may put one out a little later, but there are a ton of tutorials on how to get Kafka set up and running. But today, for our purposes, inside of a Docker container on my computer, I went ahead and I set up a Kafka broker. I've got a producer running, producing events. I've got an application consuming those events, and I've got a database that it's talking to. We're not actually going to look at the code for any of this today, just because it was all set up using the command line and inside of a Docker compose file. If you'd like to see how to do that, there's also tutorials online for that. What we're going to do is talk about a very specific scenario. So we've got this isolated in our network, and inside of that network, everything's fine. We can talk to it, we can consume, we can produce, do whatever we need to do. But let's say we had some partner or some other application that was running outside of our network that needed access to whatever events were occurring in this backend. We run into the question, how would we do that? There are a bunch of different options, but it's super, super simple when we set it up with Gravitee. So examples of when you would need that, let's say we were some sort of sports team or some sort of sports league, and we wanted to give real-time updates to various applications that were watching the game or that allowed you to bet on the game. So we'd need to set up some sort of endpoint where they could get that information so that when we provided that information, they updated in real time. Or a payment service where whenever a payment was made, we need to talk to a ledger of some sort, or we need to talk to some sort of data backend that's keeping track of that. We'd want to know as soon as that happened. Or we were running an online e-commerce store, and every time somebody checked out, we needed to pull it from inventory. But because we have distributed inventory, we'd need to let things know or let other applications know, hey, this has now been removed from inventory from this warehouse. Very, very common use cases for these types of systems that all use external applications. So, or even real-time updates for your packages since it's around Christmas time. So what we want to do is we want to be able to set up our API gateway, and we're going to expose a REST endpoint and a WebSocket endpoint. And what we're actually going to do is we're going to ignore this producer and this consumer inside of the network, and we're going to make one of these apps a producer and one of these apps a consumer so that we can push information to our Kafka topic, but also pop information from that Kafka topic. So that's going to look like this. We're going to set up our gateway REST and WebSocket endpoint using Gravitee. We're going to set up specifically a post endpoint, which is going to allow us to post data specifically to this Kafka topic. We're also going to set up a get endpoint so that we can consume any information that we need from this Kafka topic as well. So that as we make that call, we get information and data back to our application. We'll also show a WebSocket so you can see what happens in real time. So now that we have kind of a lay of the land, this is all going to be running in Docker. This is going to be running on a separate location on my computer. We're just going to start them off. They're node applications. We're going to, very first, we're going to go register our gateway proxy. We're going to connect it to our Kafka backend, and we're going to get that all set up. Then we're going to go deploy it to our developer portal so that we can register these two applications, get their API keys that we're going to set up in here, and be able to access it and provide information. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. If you haven't before, go ahead and watch our first API tutorial, which is on basic proxy gateways. It gives you a little bit of the lay of the land for Gravitee and API management. Today, we're going to be going pretty quick, so if you haven't seen that, it's a little bit slower. So let's go ahead and add our API. We're going to create a version 4 because that's the one that supports message proxies. And in the spirit of following along with last time, where we called it Parrot because it echoed what we're doing, we're sending messages, so let's go ahead and let's call this one Pigeon. We're going to give it our version number, and we're going to validate our API details. The next thing that we're going to look at is, instead of going like with this one like we did last time, we're going to go introspect messages from an event-driven backend. We're going to click on that one, and we're going to select my API architecture. Now, this is where the differentiation between endpoints and entry points comes in really handy. Just like our handy-dandy drawing over here, entry points are where people outside of our network or outside of our application are going to connect to it. So we're going to need to set up a post entry point and a get entry point, and then we will connect a single entry point. We're going to do this in purple so that you kind of understand it. A single entry point from our gateway back to our Kafka broker. So these two aren't actually things that we need. This one right here is called the endpoint in Gravitee speak. So back to setting up our actual proxy, we're going to need a get and a post. And like I said, we want to expose WebSocket as well. So we'll go ahead and click WebSocket. So we're going to hit select my entry points, and we're going to give it a context path. Let's call it, same thing, Pigeon. And this is where we could set up our individual entry points. I'm going to leave them as default because 500 messages is enough, and we don't want it to last more than 5 seconds. This quality of service, though, what we're going to do is we're going to change this to at least once on our GET request so that we make sure that we at least get something back. Post request, very much the same. We're going to do auto. And our WebSocket, we're still going to leave as auto. We're going to enable publication capacity and enable subscription, right? Because we want to be able to do both. We're going to go ahead and validate those entry points. And we're going to choose our backend service. This is where we're going to connect Kafka up to our Gravitee API gateway. So we're going to select Kafka, and we're going to hit select endpoints. Now, this is the tricky part. Because this is running inside of a Docker container, I'm going to do things a little bit differently, and you may get a little bit confused. But Docker is unique in the way it networks, where if I have a bunch of applications running underneath the same network, I can actually resolve the endpoint by using the Docker name. So normally you would type here some sort of like my.server.whatever. .com:808393, right? So that would be whatever the location of the server is that is actually hosting your Kafka client. Since I'm doing this all locally, what we're going to do is we're actually going to give it an HTTP address that just has the name of the Docker container that's running, and it will automatically resolve whatever its IP address is locally inside of that network. You can set these up with IPs, you can set these up with actual endpoints. As long as they resolve, we're able to do that. So this is the location of my Docker container, but for yours it will be different. We're going to go ahead and add us a topic. If we come down here, I want the protocol in plain text just so we can see what's happening. You can change this protocol, but we're going to have this topic. We're going to call it test. That's our producer topic. And then it's going to ask us for our consumer topic. We're going to call that test as well, because it's the same topic and I'm going to consume from both of them. We can go ahead and encode the message ID, and we're going to validate that entry point. Now, that just connected. That made this connection right here. It connected our gateway to our WebSocket. So if you're following along, what we have now is we have an app that can now hit a post endpoint. So a post endpoint is exposed, a get endpoint is exposed, and a WebSocket endpoint is exposed. We've also connected the gateway to our Kafka broker. So, like we did last time, we've got our default keyless plan. We're going to change that. We're just going to kick that plan out. We're going to add our API key plan. We're going to call it API key. If I could spell. API key. We don't want to auto-validate the subscription. We want to make sure that we're registering those applications. And we don't want you to have to provide a comment. So we're just moving right along to next. We do want to propagate the API key upstream. We're not going to rate limit or anything right now. We'll show you that in another video, as well as monetization. We're going to go ahead and add this plan. We're going to validate it. So what we've got set up now is we've got our cool application called Pigeon. or our cool API endpoint called Pigeon, which we're going to call by the path of Pigeon. And depending on if we call it with a get or a post is how we're going to either publish using post or subscribe using get. We also have the WebSocket, which we will show as well. Our endpoints are connected to Kafka, so we're going to save this and deploy. And just for context, what that does is it deploys it to the gateway that is already running on my machine, the gateway server. So we just deployed our API, our gateway API, to our gateway that's already running on my machine. We're going to open it up in API management, and we're all familiar with the danger zone, etc. You could stop, you could publish, you could make it public, you can deprecate it. Because we have already set up this plan and it is already running, what we're actually going to go ahead and do is just publish this right now. And we have to redeploy our API. And now our API is deployed and published. Let's go ahead and click on our developer portal and see what we've got going on over there. If we come here to our developer portal, this is our developer portal where we could let one of our partners or internal, external applications hop in and actually connect to an API. So let's go over here to catalog, and we can see Parrot or Pigeon. Pigeon is running. We're going to click on Pigeon. So we've got our application up and running just fine. I could connect to it. I could subscribe to it, but I would need an API key. So let's go register some applications and get us an API key. Coming over here to applications, I've already set up these applications. They're simple Node applications running on my machine. If you want to see those, they sit right here. And we can see we've kind of done some testing with them. But I'm going to go ahead and set up the producer first. Inside of the producer, I want to go to subscriptions, and I want to select an API. If it'll let me. If it won't, the quick way to do it is to go to catalog, Pigeon, subscribe. Okay, it's going to ask us, do we want to subscribe with an API key? We do. We're going to go ahead and hit next. We're going to choose an application, and we want the producer application. We're going to validate that request, and now it's pending. You can see this little clock right here. We're going to come back here to our API management. For those of you who have never approved a request for an API key, the way you do that is you go to Plans, come up here to Subscriptions. We can see that producer right here is pending. We're going to click on the Edit, scroll down and validate it to approve it. I'm not going to give it a time limit, and it gives us our API key right here. I'm going to copy that, and we can then hop back into the developer portal. I'm going to refresh it. And now we can take a look at our applications. We can see our producer, look at our subscriptions, and we can see which API we're subscribed to. We're subscribed to Pigeon, and we've got our API key right there. So let's go ahead and hook that up. I'm going to pull up my application that was running. Let me clear this real quick. Clear this one as well. And we're going to hop into an index.js. Just so you know, this is super simple, super small, super lightweight. All it does is every 3 seconds, we've got it on a timer, we're going to send it this little chunk of data that says, hello world, in a key value pair. Inside of our environment, we have a producer API key. So we're going to add that, we're going to save that, and then let's go ahead and start our producer. We've also got a producer set up. Uh-oh, we've got an error. Let's go figure out that error. Alrighty, so that error, this is why we write things to a console. That error, very quickly, is just say post/Kafka. If we look back, and this is a simple mistake, anybody could make it. If we look back at our endpoint, and we come here to info, we can see we didn't name it Kafka this time. We named it Pigeon. And if we look at our endpoint, we want to be calling Pigeon, not Kafka. So very simply, all I'm going to do when I create that request, all I'm going to do when I create that request is come up here where I've called it, localhost, which is where it's running, and I'm going to call Pigeon instead. We still have our API key. We still have everything else running just fine. We just need to change the endpoint. So let's go ahead and clear this again, if I can spell. And let's go ahead and rerun that. And now we can see I've got it logging whenever it logs and comes back with the correct status. We've got a message sent successfully. So we're going to let that run for a minute because we want to be able to consume it here in a second. So let's go ahead and grab our consumer and set him up as well. So we're going to hop back here into our developer portal. I'm going to go back to catalog. I'm going to click on Pigeon. And then I'm going to subscribe to it. But I want to subscribe this time with a different application. So we're going to get that API key plan. This application is going to be our consumer. And this consumer is just going to call a get endpoint. And what it's going to do is it's going to return whatever we have set up or whatever events have occurred since we last called it. If we've never called it, it'll give us all of them, right? That's why we went with at least once. Let's validate that request. We're going to hop back in here and approve. And I'm going kind of quick right here just because this is something that you'll do over and over and over. Come in here to this plan, go to subscriptions. We can see we have a new subscription pending. Let's go authorize that. Let's go ahead and copy this to the clipboard. And then we're going to hop back into our applications here. We're going to pull up our consumer. And notice, I did the same thing here. This is Kafka. Our endpoint isn't Kafka anymore. It's Pigeon. And we're going to go give us a consumer API key. And if you try and use these API keys, they won't go anywhere because it's running locally on my machine. And I'm going to roll them before we release the video. But just for context, you don't want to expose these like this, like I'm doing right here. So let's go ahead and let's run our consumer. And we can see, as our consumer runs, we might have overloaded it, but we've got one message that comes back because we want at least one message. Let's run it again. And this is continually running. And so we're going to keep getting messages. It took us 4 before we ran it. But we can see the message that was sent to the producer right here. Hello world is coming back right here. What we can also do is we can also hook up a WebSocket. So if I come here and I run my WebSocket, you can see here that I've got a Gravitee API key. That Gravitee API key is no longer registered, but we do have a consumer API key that we just copied to our clipboard. So I'm using WebSocket. Basically, this is going to hit our WebSocket endpoint and allow us to receive in real time every time we get a call or every time we get something pushed or published from our producer. So let's call it. Error running the WebSocket. Awesome. 404 not found. Oh, I did the same thing. I'm going to make this mistake at least 4 times. See where I said Kafka there? We don't want Kafka. We've called it Pigeon. But as we sit here, we can see it goes from the very, very beginning. And we can see every time a new one gets pushed, we get the same information. So every time a new one gets pushed or published by our publisher that's outside of our network, we're able to receive it through a WebSocket. So just a quick recap for everybody who wanted to follow along. We just went through and set up a event-driven backend Kafka system, or an event-driven system using Kafka. We just set up an API gateway that allows for 3 separate endpoints to be hit. One that is a WebSocket, one that is a GET request, and one that is a POST request, so that applications outside of our network can actually publish messages and receive messages in real time, if that's what we prefer, to a system that we either don't own or that we would like access to. So super simple with Gravitee. It took me all of about 20 minutes to explain and do everything. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments down below. I'm always looking for feedback, so if you'd like to let me know what I could help you out with or do better, I appreciate your time. Thanks for joining me in the lab, and we'll see you next time.